Go back to what we're looking at. Remember, we're going back to this idea of the American dream, right? And the prompt we said is Truslow's or Adams' definition of the dream currently attainable for every person? Has the definition of the dream changed over time? Do dreams of wealth now supersede dreams of rising in social order, right? So we looked at all those things. Remember, we looked at the idea of his different perspectives. So what were the claims that we said, that we listed, that Adams wrote about the American dream? What did he claim?
So the first one was the promise of bounty and equal opportunity.
Okay.
One was opportunities that are available to those who work hard and earn it. Three is it's not simply money and material goods. Fourth is a person's ability to achieve something based off of their ability and natural talents. And the fifth one is judged for their ability and talent rather than your birth class.
Okay. So we're looking at that through the perspective of 1931 white guy, right? So we're looking at, is the American dream still attainable for everybody today, right? And we're going to show it through time. So the other article that you read was kind of the evolution of the American dream. That's that other packet that we talked about, so that will give you some reference. But remember, what we're looking at is we're looking at a form of a DBQ, but synthesis is a little different. DBQ is heavy on sources or your documents, we'll say. This is going to be heavy on your opinion. But your opinion has to be more than just the documents, right? So we have to look at the idea of American dream through multiple lenses. So today we are going to jump into the other America. And this is one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. Probably not one that you have heard of before. I actually hadn't heard of it until I heard it on Audible. And it was being read by Wanda Sykes, and I listened to it, and I was like, ooh, I like this. So let's go through and look at this. So by 1967, war, racism, and poverty had become the dominant issues confronting America and the freedom movement. On April 4th, Dr. King forcefully speaks out against the Vietnam War with Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, delivered at Riverside Church in New York City. 10 days later, in a speech at Stanford University titled The Other America, Dr. King addresses race, poverty, and economic justice. Annotate for how Martin Luther King Jr. defines the American dream or the lack thereof it. All right, so a couple of things. 1967, we're looking at context, right? So this is like historical context to what's happening, right? All right. He gave a speech at Stanford. Well, first of all, let's go to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is your speaker, and this always kind of informs how we see a piece, right? Like how we understand their perspective. What do we know about Martin Luther King Jr.?
He's a civil rights.
Okay, so he was an influential civil rights leader. What else?
He's a pastor.
He was. What else?
He's an African-American born during
He was what? He wasn't born during the civil rights movement, but he was African American. He was, yeah, I mean, he was born before that. I mean, he lived through segregation, yes, absolutely. He was also of the Southern Christian Leadership Movement, which he was the president of, and that was over the entire South. So although he grew up, I think, in, I want to say Alabama, he was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Movement through the entire South, which was one of the leading movements for civil rights, right? So he was influential, obviously. Okay. So he gave a speech at Stanford University in the 60s. Who is in his audience at Stanford University? White, privileged. It could be, we would be students, you could be faculty members. But also Stanford is kind of seen like, I mean, that's West Coast, right? So that's very kind of liberal, very forward thinking. So is it going to be a group that is open to this idea of racial justice? Yeah, yes. In California, it's going to be much more open than you would say delivering something at Alabama University or the University of Alabama, right? Like it's a little bit more liberal. So they're going to be a little bit more open to listening to what he's going to say. All right. So notice these are his topics: the idea of race, poverty, and economic justice. All those things play into, I think those are all components, I would say, of, and I'm just going to abbreviate AD, of the American dream. So when we looked at the lens, if you look at the lens now through your lens of the American dream, what would you say ultimately? So the way that Truslow Adams defines it is like, we used to define it through like ownership of land, right? Wealth, material goods, right? But it's more than that. So how would we define it today? This is going to be your research paper.
Everyone just wants to be famous. Like, everyone just wants to be known for something.
Okay, so recognition.
Yeah.
We would see the American dream as able to be publicly recognized, right? All right, what else?
Having money.
Okay, so having money, that part hasn't changed. How do we, early 1900s, how did people that we would say achieved the American dream, how did they get their money? Where did they get their money? Mostly from?
They work for it.
Land ownership. Yeah, I would say a lot of like family wealth, right? Or you have like, when you think of like the true American dream, that's somebody that came with nothing, that like built themselves into something like a corporation or an ownership, or somebody that had influential money. Okay, so do we think that through the lens of someone that is working towards civil rights, that was the president of like the Southern Christian Leadership Movement, do we think his idea or definition of the American dream is going to be the same as that? No. Okay. The other America. What does that suggest if we're looking at the title?
What it's not right now.
Okay, so say that again.
What it's not at that time.
Okay, so what America is not. Okay, what else does the other America suggest?
Maybe like what's hidden, what you don't see.
Okay, so it's hidden. Not seen. Good. All right, y'all ready? I am not a great reader like King was, so bear with me. Members of the faculty and members of the student body of this great institution of learning, ladies and gentlemen. Now there are several things that one could talk about before such a large, concerned, and enlightened audience. There are so many problems facing our nation and our world that one could just take off anywhere. But today I would like to talk mainly about the race problem, since I'll have to rush right out and go to New York to talk about Vietnam tomorrow. And I've been talking about it a great deal this week and weeks before that. But I'd like to use a subject from which to speak this afternoon, the other America. And I use this subject because there are literally two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation, and in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all of their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. All right, so in America, we're going to say like number 1. What do we have? We have like physical beauty. We have prosperity and opportunity. We have food and material goods. We have culture and education. We have freedom and human dignity. What does human dignity mean?
Like we're not afraid to be human.
Yes. A little bit.
Careful. What do you do?
It's your pride.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you feel good about yourself. Like human dignity, like you are proud to be a being, right? Like you are proud of yourself. You are proud of the things that you have. You are proud of your community. You have that sense of self, right? So, do we agree that those are all aspects of the American dream? Can we divide them up into different parts of like your health, right? So he said like physical beauty, prosperity, opportunity, food and material goods, those all have to do with your, like I would say like physical well-being, right? Culture, education, freedom, human dignity, that has to do with what kind of well-being? Yeah. So, I mean, I think all those things define like the components of the American dream. That it's not just physical, it's also mental. And notice that he ends on this idea of young people growing up, right? So that there is hope. Why do they see hope and opportunity? Because they are surrounded by all these things while they grow up. Makes sense, right? Who's in this other America? Who's that other America for? You think the African Americans live in this America?
Oh no, but like it's
White, privileged people. But tragically, so you see this shift, right? But tragically, unfortunately, there is another America. So we're going to look for those descriptors for the second America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ebullient of hope into the fatigue of despair. So what you'll notice is what I've done below is I've gone through, I think, most of it and made footnotes for definitions for us. So this idea of ebulliency, right, being this cheerful energy, this exuberance, this happiness, right, which we see above. And it changes it from hope into despair. So in the other America, this ugliness, you have this idea of energy being changed into despair. So what I think here is that he's suggesting that there is a change, meaning that it has evolved into this, right? In this America, millions of work-starved men walk the streets daily and search for jobs that do not exist. So you have people that want work, but there are no jobs for them to find. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. All right, we seeing our contrast between the two Americas? I think I did it to where it's just top and bottom. In this America, people are poor by the millions. So this is back in 1960, what do we say, 67? 67? Still true today?
Yes.
Absolutely. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. So look at that contrast, right? So saying that they have poverty, but around them is prosperity. So what does this do for your mental well-being? To live in poverty, but all around you is material goods, prosperity. It wears you out. Yeah, mentally and physically it wears you down, right? Okay. In a sense, the greatest tragedy of this other America is what it does to little children. Little children in this other America are forced to grow up with clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies. As we look at this other America, we see it as an arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Many people of various backgrounds live in this other America. Some are Mexican Americans, some are Puerto Ricans, some are Indians. Some happen to be from other groups. Millions of them are Appalachian whites. But probably the largest group in this other America in proportion to its size in the population is the American Negro. All right, so first answer that question. What is it that King suggests is the greatest tragedy for other Americans? For this other America? Yes. Why is this the greatest tragedy?
Because they're supposed to be the hope.
Okay, good.
Children are the future.
Yes, Whitney Houston. And what's worse is if they grow up with this sense of inferiority, if they grow up in this world of feeling inferior as children, how do they become as adults?
It becomes embedded in.
Mm-hmm. Notice, though, that he also points out the other people that live in this America, right? Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Indians, Appalachian whites, right? These are all still really true today. And I would say there are even more in this category today because of the increase of our immigration. The American Negro finds himself living in a triple ghetto. A ghetto of race, a ghetto of poverty, and a ghetto of human misery. And remember, this is the opposite of that human dignity, right? So if human dignity, we said, was this feeling of your control of yourself and proud of yourself, the human misery is the exact opposite, right? Of continuing to feel that way. So what we are seeking to do in the civil rights movement is to deal with this problem. To deal with this problem of the two Americas. We are seeking to make America one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. notice he continues to do this, right? He continues to reference or mimic the language of our founding documents, right? Where before we had, yep, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? What's that from?
Some guy said it.
No, it's from.
Some guy said it.
No, it's not.
No, it's some guy said
No,
it.
he made it during a speech. It was
A speech means he said it.
Some guy said it during a speech.
Some old guy.
It's from what?
It is, but
What's his-
it got put
yeah.
in there
He's a
from the
founding
speech.
father.
Yes, it did. It was in a speech. Don't tell me I'm wrong.
It was that one guy.
Oh my God, y'all's history.
She said the answer.
We did it.
Who is it?
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Is it?
He's a founding father, yes.
Wait, but who's the main guy? Who said it? Who
Oh,
actually said
good
it?
God, your history
Did
teachers.
we do a thing on it?
Did we do? Did we do?
I
I don't know, did we?
It was Kid Cudi.
No, it was not.
He said it in his song.
So then here we have, we are seeking to make America one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What is that from? You say it every morning. Now let me say that the struggle for civil rights and the struggle to make these two Americas one America is much more difficult today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. For about a decade or maybe 12 years, we've struggled all across the South in glorious struggles to get rid of legal, overt segregation and all of the humiliation that surrounded that system of segregation. So far, like up to now, it has been a legal struggle, right? In a sense, this was a struggle for decency. We could not go to a lunch counter in so many instances and get a hamburger or a cup of coffee. We could not make use of public accommodations. Public transportation was segregated, and we often had to sit in the back and within transportation within cities, we often had to stand over empty seats because sections were reserved for whites only. We did not have the right to vote in so many areas of the South, and the struggle was to deal with these problems. So it's a struggle for human decency. But it was backed by, like, legal issues, right? The idea of segregation. And certainly, they were difficult problems. They were humiliating conditions. By the thousands, we protested these conditions. We made it clear that it was ultimately more honorable to accept jail cell experiences than to accept segregation and humiliation. By the thousands, students and adults decided to sit in at segregated lunch counters to protest conditions there. When they were sitting at those lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and seeking to take the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So their protests were based on the founding fathers' ideals and values. Many things were gained as a result of these years of struggle. In 1964, the Civil Rights Bill came into being after the Birmingham movement, which did a great deal to subpoena the conscience of a large segment of the nation to appear before the judgment seat of morality on the whole question of civil rights. Okay, so check, we got the Civil Rights Bill passed. Again, that was legal, right? After the Selma movement in 1965, we were able to get a voting rights bill. So again, those are all legal. Does the American dream have anything to do with legal rights? No. And all of these things represented strides. So this was movement forward. But we must see that the struggle today is much more difficult. It's more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality. All right, so how is that? How are those laws not genuine equality?
Because it kind of just like, they gave them to them in the beginning because the people were arguing that they weren't getting, like, they weren't being treated fairly. So they were being needy and they were like, here, we'll give you what you want. So it wasn't like out of the kindness of their heart. It was just to make them stop.
Okay, so you would say like the original purpose for providing for like passing those laws was not like a genuine purpose. Not out of like a moral ability to do it, okay?
Well, just because the laws changed doesn't mean the people change.
Hey, there we go.
Why are you looking at me? Okay then.
Like the voting rights, like there's
What?
no literacy tests, not of African Americans are educated.
Okay, so sometimes even the voting rights bill wasn't enacted legally, right? Yes. Okay. So lack of education still affects them, right? Lack of opportunity still affects them. So even though these rights were passed, do they still have equality?
No.
Not necessarily. Maybe they have some rights in order to back them up in legality, but like we said, not necessarily in the views of all Americans. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job. Why is it easier?
I mean, because those things can be enforced, but the other ones don't.
Yes. This can be enforced. How do you enforce a livable income? I mean, but you can't enforce it. I can't say, here's this law that says, right? I mean, even our minimum wage is not a livable income. I mean, let's be honest, my wage is barely a livable income. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It is much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine, quality, integrated education a reality. There's that word genuine again. Quality, integrated. So sometimes even though it's integrated, it may not be the same quality as another school. And so today we are struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. Yep. Somebody look up the definition of genuine.
Be quiet.
Brooks, what does genuine mean?
Genuine means truly what something is said to be authentic.
So, if the bill says that it's an equal rights bill, right, or a civil rights bill, then it should actually be that. But that's not what is happening throughout this other America. It's not merely a struggle against extremist behavior toward Negroes, and I'm convinced that many of the very people who supported us in the struggle in the South are not willing to go all the way now. I came to see this in a very difficult and painful way in Chicago the last year where I lived and worked. Some of the people who came quickly to march with us in Selma and Birmingham weren't active around Chicago. And I came to see that so many people who supported morally and even financially what we were doing in Birmingham and Selma were really outraged against the extremist behavior of Bull Connor and Jim Clark toward Negroes, rather than believing in genuine equality for Negroes. Okay, so let's take a minute and look at that. What is the difference about being outraged against the extremist behavior rather than believing in genuine equality for Negroes?
I mean, they were looking. It was like the North looking at the South treating slaves, and they're like, we don't want slaves anymore. But even when slavery was demolished, they didn't do anything to help the people who were slaves get jobs and do anything like that. It was more of just like, well, now you have the best of worst. What is there to do?
Yeah, and he actually goes back to Frederick Douglass here in a little bit. Yes, agreed. So look at what Bull Connor and Jim Clark. So if you are outraged against that extremist behavior, like, I can't believe that's how they were acting, instead of, I can't believe they don't have equal rights. Equal opportunity. So, I mean, listen, we appreciate that you are supporting us. I can't believe that they don't have equal rights or equal opportunity. I totally get that, right? And that's great, but I'm not seeing that. I'm outraged that you're treated this way, or that those are the conditions, but I'm not really seeing it from the perspective of what is the outcome, right? And I think this is what we've got to see now, and this is what makes the struggle much more difficult. So as a result of all this, we see many problems existing today that are growing more difficult. It's something that is often overlooked, but Negroes generally live in worse slums than 20 or 25 years ago. In the North, schools are more segregated today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court's decision on desegregation was rendered. Economically, the Negro is worse off today than he was 15, 20 years ago. And so the unemployment rate among whites at one time was about the same as the unemployment rate among Negroes. Today, the unemployment rate among Negroes is twice that of whites. And the average income of the Negro is 50% less than whites. Okay, so now we have worse slums. We have more segregation. We have 2 times the rate of unemployment. And we have 50% less income. So, looking at all that, how is this other America expected to achieve the American dream? Right? So if this is what they're facing, then how are they supposed to have opportunities? How are they supposed to provide for their families? How are they supposed to live in a community where they feel safe and feel good and move forward, right? How are they supposed to achieve the American dream if they can't even get these simple, basic things in America already? As we look at these problems, we see them growing and developing every day. We see the fact that the Negro economically is facing a depression in his everyday life that is more staggering than the depression of the 30s. The unemployment rate of the nation as a whole is about 8%, about 4%. Statistics would say from the Labor Department that among Negroes it's about 8.4%, but these are persons who are in the labor market, who still go to the employment agencies to seek jobs, and so they can be calculated. The statistics cannot be gotten because they are still somehow in the labor market. So it's double, right? But he's saying that those are ones that are still trying for jobs. But there are hundreds of thousands of Negroes who have given up. So the unemployment rate is double what whites are, but that counts only for the people that continue to try to go. There are thousands of African Americans who are not even trying anymore. So that rate is even double that. Does that make sense? They've lost hope. So the loss of hope does not equal the American dream. They've come to feel that life is a long and desolate corridor for them with no exit sign, and so they no longer go to look for a job. There are those who would estimate that these persons, who are called the discouraged persons, these 6 or 7% in the community, that means that unemployment among Negroes may well be 16%. So we aren't at the 4%. We are 4 times the unemployment rate. Among Negro youth in some of our larger urban areas, it goes to 30 and 40%. Why is the youth unemployment rate higher?
Because it's the same thing we were talking about earlier, how it's affecting the children more.
So it affects them more. What else? Are you going to go look for a job if your father, uncle, older brother can't find a job?
No.
If they're already discouraged, they're not encouraging me to go out and find a job, right? Because they've already given up. So if they've already given up, of those, what do they call them? They called them the discouraged people or the discouraged persons. If those discouraged persons are giving up, they're telling their family to give up too, right? So it's that trickle-down effect. So you can see what I mean when I say that in the Negro community, there is a major, tragic, and staggering depression that we face in our everyday lives. Now, the other thing that we've got to come to see now that many of us didn't see too well during the last 10 years, that is that racism is still alive in American society. Duh, that's even true still today. And much more widespread than we realized. And we must see racism for what it is. It is a myth of the superior and the inferior race. That is, again, not part of the American dream. It is the false and tragic notion that one particular group, one particular race is responsible for all the progress, all of the insights in the total flow of history, and the theory that another group or another race is totally depraved, innately impure, and innately inferior. In the final analysis, racism is evil because its ultimate logic is genocide. Hitler was a sick and tragic man who carried racism to its logical conclusion. He ended up leading a nation to the point of killing about 6 million Jews. This is the tragedy of racism because its ultimate logic is genocide. If one says that I am not good enough to live next door to him, if one says that I am not good enough to eat at a lunch counter, or to have a good, decent job, or to go to school with him merely because of my race, he is saying consciously or unconsciously that I do not deserve to exist. So what is he saying about today? He's using this idea of what happened in Nazi Germany. Why is that the same thing that's happening here? Yes. So Hitler consciously discriminated against Jews, killed, murdered, right? And he's saying the same thing is happening here subconsciously or unconsciously. All right, we'll stop there for today. All right, I need you to put your name on your passage for me, please.